Thank you very much. Thank you especially to Mrs. Mayton and Dr. Rutherford for inviting me to be here with you this morning. I don't think I've ever had an entrance quite as dramatic as that, so that was kind of fun. Okay, so today I think virtually everyone knows what George Washington looked like. His is the face on the American $1 bill, recognized around the world as the face of the nation, a graphic signifier, if you will, in all manner of modern communications. Now, I think there are two misconceptions that I want to talk about today in how we think about this image of America's first president. First, it's often assumed that Stuart's likeness was an official image, created for some governmental function, perhaps even authorized by Washington. A second misconception is that the acceptance of Stuart's rendition of this image as the iconic likeness of Washington was virtually immediate and universal, appearing as if by osmosis on everything from engravings and book illustrations to wallpaper, Chinese porcelains, stoneware jugs, printed handkerchiefs, and silk embroideries. Both of these ideas, I would argue, have about as much historical accuracy as Parson Weems' fabled cherry tree or George Washington's wooden teeth. To the contrary, the story of Stuart's Washington portraits and their rise to preeminence is much more complicated. During his lifetime, George Washington sat for nearly 24 portraitists, including sculptors. And what you see here is a selection of 21 of those lifetime portraits, arranged roughly in chronological order, with the top row images produced prior to the presidency and the bottom two rows created during the presidency. Now, debate has long flourished as to which of these has the best pedigree and preserves the truest likeness, and thus the vast majority of literature on Washington's portraits focuses on individual works or artists and on questions of authenticity, accuracy, artistry, and provenance. This emphasis on the trees has obscured our view of the forest. And I think the larger picture is that Washington did not commission any portraits of himself for public consumption. And in so doing, he diverged from the established practice by heads of state of commissioning an official state portrait. So there is no authorized official portrait of George Washington. When he retired, he left his countrymen with an array of competing likenesses, none of which enjoyed that official imprimatur. So, how then did one particular image out of all of these come to be accepted as the iconic portrait of the man, and more than that, the face of the nation? So to think about that story, what I want to talk about today is, first of all, who was Gilbert Stuart? What training, tools, templates did he bring to the task of portraying George Washington? What portraits did he actually paint of George Washington? And then I want to look at some competing images post-Gilbert Stuart, several key episodes in the rise to prominence of his likeness, from the painter's studio to the depths of the Great Depression in 1932, when Americans celebrated the bicentennial of George Washington's birth. And coming out of all of that, I want to suggest some new ways of thinking about the image of George Washington and why all of this is worth taking note of some 220 years later. Now, by all accounts, Gilbert Stuart was the most gifted portraitist to work in America up to his time, and perhaps one of the best since then. He was born in the New England seaport of Newport, Rhode Island, 20 years before the American Revolution. At age 19, he set sail for England. That was September 1775, so 3 months after George Washington had taken command of the Continental Army in Cambridge, and 6 months before he had succeeded in driving the British out of Boston. Stuart spent the next 12 years amid the giddy art world in London, where he became a highly successful society portraitist, leading off with this full-length exhibition piece that you see on the left called The Skater. And note the black velvet suit, very fashionable, which we will be seeing again and again. He also painted a visiting celebrity on the right, Joseph Brant, the king of the Mohawks from America. And he painted leading artists, actors, military leaders, aristocrats. He seems to have been consciously apolitical. There's no real evidence that he followed the American Revolution, and no indication in this period that he had any thoughts of returning to the infant United States. So in 1787, as Americans rewrote their Constitution at the convention presided over by George Washington, Stuart and his family decamped from London rather suddenly and rather mysteriously to Ireland. Stuart, it seems, had developed a bad habit of accepting 50% of his fees on the commission of a portrait and then not completing the portrait. This eventually caught up with him. And in the center, you see another one of his London portraits, really coming out of that bad habit. It's a portrait he started of John Jay in 1784. He never finished it. He pawned it for funds, and it ended up being finished 10 years later by another American artist, John Trumbull. Now, in Dublin, Stuart was equally successful as an artist and unsuccessful as a businessman. He had little competition on the portrait front and was quickly recognized as the city's preeminent portraitist, painting leading Anglo-Irish nobility, clerics, and statesmen. These Irish portraits are less studies in character or personality than they are displays of rank and power, as you see here in these full lengths of two notable statesmen in Ireland, John Fitzgibbon, the Lord Chancellor, and John Foster, the Speaker of the House of Commons. Both of them are notable for the array of accoutrements that marks their official position. So Fitzgibbon's black silk robe and suit, his silver gilt mace, and the Lord Chancellor's purse lying near his feet. Foster with papers symbolizing the legislation that he put through supporting linen manufacture, agricultural reform, law books, his expertise on trade and law propelling his rise to the position of Speaker. Once again, Stuart left town abruptly with unpaid debts and unfinished pictures. He sailed for the U.S. in March of 1793, so at the beginning of George Washington's second term as president. And this return seems to have been inspired primarily by economic calculations, as he announced, quote, "In America, I expect to make a fortune by Washington alone. I calculate upon making a plurality of his portraits, whole length, that will enable me, if I should be fortunate, to repay my English and Irish creditors." His first stop was New York, where there were several active artists, but no really first-rate portraitists to offer him competition. He also could tap into a network of contacts there to establish himself again as the society portraitist. Chief among those contacts, again, was John Jay, who apparently forgave him for not finishing those original portraits and commissioned a new one that you see on the left in his academic Harvard robes that he received with his honorary degree. Another friend that Stuart had in New York was the painter John Trumbull, who was, as I've suggested, very patriotic and well-connected in government circles. He had been a former military aide, and he also painted Washington's full-length portrait that you see on the left. That one was for the city of Charleston. And he had also been commissioned by the New York Chamber of Commerce to paint a Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, that you see on the right. And so both of those is similar format for a standing portrait. You'll see this again and again, both addressing the challenge of how do you portray a Republican leader. After a successful year and a half in New York, Stuart was ready to move forward with his main plan. And this time he does seem to have been going to something rather than away from something. In November of 1794, he journeyed to Philadelphia, then the capital of the United States. Now, much ink has been spilled by art historians and biographers trying to sort out Stuart's really astoundingly extensive production of George Washington portraits. He painted at least 100 portraits, replicas of the same basic sittings over the course of 3 decades. And so art historians have labored to trace provenance back to original purchasers, trying to establish the dates of production, trying to establish groups based on particular details, because if you do look closely at these paintings that seem to be all the same, repeating over and over again, Stuart never did paint exactly the same face twice. There are always little differences. And I think this tension between variation and repetition is one of the ongoing sources of fascination with these images, suggested by this installation at the Met in their Stuart retrospective a few years ago. But if we step back and focus on the face, I think sorting out the Stuarts becomes really a much simpler exercise. There are 2 distinct faces, painted just a few months apart, as though George Washington had just shifted his pose to look one way and then the other. The first of these that you see on the left, which is called the Vaughan type, was painted at Stuart's initiative. So really, Stuart is contacting Washington saying, I want to paint your portrait. Washington agrees to sit for the portrait, probably in the fall of 1795. And over the next few months, Stuart produced about 17 replicas of this Vaughan portrait, fulfilling a list of 32 orders he had, or 36 orders from 32 patrons in both England and America. But he wasn't really satisfied with the composition, and in fact, he claimed to have scrubbed out his first version of it and repainted it. And in the spring of 1796, he got 2 new commissions, and that led to the portrait that you see on the right, which is called the Athenaeum type. Now, the first of these 2 commissions was actually from Martha Washington, who apparently wasn't satisfied with that first portrait either. And she wanted a pair of portraits of her and the general to hang in the parlor at Mount Vernon. This portrait was deliberately, by Stuart, never completed, much to Mrs. Washington's disappointment. Stuart kept it in his studio because if it wasn't finished, he didn't have to deliver it, and it served as the model for his replicas. The second commission of 1796 was much grander. A full-length portrait that you see on the left, ordered by William and Anne Willing Bingham. William Bingham was a senator from Pennsylvania, and they ordered it as a gift for an English peer, the Marquis of Lansdowne, who had been supportive of the American cause during the Revolution. And in London during the 1780s, he and the Binghams had been part of a circle of American and British businessmen and statesmen who were eager to reestablish Anglo-American trade, and who had been among Stuart's London patrons. Now, this full length was likely where Stuart had hoped to go all along. Recall his claim on leaving Ireland that he calculated upon making a plurality of Washington portraits whole length. Now, although George Washington is documented as having given Stuart 1 sitting at least, specifically for this commission, his face is virtually the same as that seen in the many Athenaeum portraits. The Lansdowne, in turn, inspired commissions to Stuart for 8 replicas, and the Constable Hamilton portrait, which you see on the far right, which is now at Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, named for an Irish-born New York merchant who commissioned it as a gift for Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Now, the Constable Hamilton portrait is unique among Stuart's George Washington portraits. It's the only half-length seated variation of the Lansdowne, almost as though George Washington got tired and simply sat down in that chair that's behind him in the Lansdowne. It's simpler in some sense because instead of having a number of books referring to the various things that Washington was involved with, it has a single document, which is thought to have been the Jay Treaty negotiating with Great Britain in 1795. The seascape in the back is also unique in Washington portraits and is thought to refer to perhaps Alexander Hamilton's interests in trade, in commercial policy, and his critical support for the Jay Treaty. Now, if we put that Constable Hamilton portrait in context with Stuart's other work, you can see that it's very much a piece with the portraits that he's been painting all along of businessmen, civic leaders, and so forth. The seated pose, the red upholstery, the drapery in the background, sometimes a scenic view in the background relating to the subject's interests, sometimes papers on the table, again referring to the subject's specific accomplishments and so forth. What is less common in Stuart's work, although he does sometimes paint military men in uniform or diplomats in their full regalia that you see here, it's relatively less than his painting more civilian figures. And he is unique among 18th century American portraitists of George Washington in that he never shows Washington in uniform. The military trope for portraying Washington was really the most popular by far throughout Washington's lifetime. Now, going back to the Lansdowne portrait, we can see that its format contrasts dramatically with Stuart's other portraits. So first of all, it's monumental in scale. It towers more than 8 feet tall compared to 4 feet high for the original Athenaeum portrait and about 30 inches for the Vaughan portrait and other replicas. We see Washington in a formal, full-length pose in this very conventional art historical setting framed by classical architecture, voluminous drapery. He's in his official presidential garb, which was a black velvet suit, that fashionable attire that he is well documented as wearing for formal occasions of the presidency. And he's surrounded by the trappings of office, symbolic elements like on the table leg, there are a pair of eagles surmounting the fasces or bound stalks representing the unity of state. The presidential chair behind him is adorned with the shield, the seal of the great shield, the Great Seal of the United States. It should be right in here somewhere. And his writing table set up for the work of governing. So instead of the crown and the symbols of being the head of state, you have symbols of doing the work of governing. So art historically, the Lansdowne portrait corresponds to a tradition of state portraiture associated with hereditary European rulers since at least the 17th century. So you see on the right a portrait of George I, Louis XVI. You can see then on the left Stuart adapting this tradition to non-royal statesmen in Ireland, and then to the Republican leader of the United States. Same pose, same framework, different accoutrements, different symbolisms. So in the Lansdowne portrait, he skillfully adapts these established conventions to represent what is really a quite novel figure on the world stage, and that is a non-royal, elected, temporary civilian head of state. So we have these visual similarities, which are very clear, but functionally, Stuart's Lansdowne portrait comes from quite a different place. So state portraits, as the name suggests, were a deliberate vehicle for wielding royal authority. They're commissioned by the monarch on the ascension to the throne as a means of proclaiming legitimacy, and they are disseminated through official channels, hung in government buildings, sent out with government ministers, and so they establish an official authorized likeness. This is what the monarch looks like. This is the face of that nation. Stuart's Lansdowne portrait, in contrast, originated as a private commission in the final years of George Washington's presidency. It's a gift from one Washington admirer to another Washington admirer who just happens to be a British peer. Immediately on its completion, it's shipped off from London. It's shipped off to London. So it's not really seen that much in the United States. It goes off to London. So what we have now are two closely related portraits of George Washington. The one, the face, the Athenaeum portrait, I think functioning visually as a sort of shorthand, a reminder, a stand-in for that full-length formal portrait. At the end of the 18th century, one is hanging in the artist's studio outside Philadelphia, and the other is ensconced in a palatial mansion in the capital of America's former revolutionary foe. Not, one would think, the most auspicious beginning for creating an American national icon. So, how do these images come to be regarded as the consummate images of the first American president? Well, one important factor is timing. First, Stuart lived a long time, and Washington didn't. He died on December 14, 1799, 2 weeks before the end of the century. He had a real eye for timing there. George Washington was struck down at age 67 by a severe throat infection, contracted just 2 days earlier. So his death really took the nation by surprise. People kind of thought Washington would go on forever, and he was going to be the key to the stability of the new nation. And if you remember Y2K and the concerns about the ending of the century, the ending of the millennium, well, there was something like this, that the 1800 was approaching. The nation is brand new, we really haven't made these traditions, and all of a sudden Washington, who's been the figure of stability for 25 years, is gone. So there is an immediate demand, he's no longer going to be around to sit for more portraits, so there's an immediate demand for images of Washington. Within weeks, the legislatures of Connecticut and Rhode Island, strongholds of Washington's Federalist policy, have come in with orders for 3 monumental replicas for their state houses of the Lansdowne Portrait, and then the orders continue to flock in, so that by the end of his life, Stuart painted more than 75 replicas of the simpler bust-length Athenaeum portrait. And this kept Stuart finally financially solvent. He called it, sort of ironically, his $100 bill, because that's what he charged for these. In addition, copying the Athenaeum head became something of a rite of passage for aspiring American artists, resulting in countless echoes of more or less artistry and authenticity. And believe me, I see some awful copies of the Stuart Athenaeum head. So, to truly understand the popularization of George Washington's image, we have to look beyond the oil paintings and turn to prints. Because in the 18th century, people didn't have the internet. You couldn't hop on and see all these different portraits all over the place. Oil portraits were primarily seen in private homes. There were relatively few opportunities for public display of them. There weren't museums all over the place. So it was printmakers primarily who disseminated Washington's image to that broader populace through media that ranged from high quality, what we would call HD, mezzotint portraits, to cheap engravings, book illustrations, little vignettes on top of sheet music, and other ephemeral formats. Now, there's no complete census of these graphic takeoffs of Stuart, but estimates range as high as hundreds of thousands of prints by more than 400 known printmakers. So this is a complicated subject, as you can imagine, and so art historians tend to focus on paintings, which is easier. But the prints are really important. Now, Stuart's paintings were done in 1796. It takes 2 years before they are out in engraved form. So you have an engraving issued in London in January of 1798, seen on the left, which is quite nice. Then you have the first American version, which appears in Philadelphia in 1798. well, I'm glad it didn't flourish too much. Fortunately, they got better after that. It took yet another 2 years for a print version of the monumental full-length Lansdowne to get back in the United States, and you see that on the right. Now, by then, George Washington had died, and as I mentioned, demand for imagery was surging. So Stuart's image has the advantage, again, of timing. It's new, it's novel, it's the latest image of Washington. And it's advertised in America when it arrives in the spring of 1800 as, quote, the leading portrait of Washington, which is said, we don't know by who, but it is said to, quote, be uncommonly faithful. Indeed, Stuart's fidelity to his original is so great that we scarcely ever see a portrait from his pencil that could not be immediately identified. Well, it seems to me that's the job of a portraitist, right? You want it to be recognizable. But he did have this, really strong reputation among the taste setters, and he was known for creating portraits of personality more than necessarily physiological likenesses. And as a society portrait, people are painting him to make pleasing portraits, and by and large, Stuart's portraits are pleasing. So the question of accuracy, in some sense, that fidelity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it is said to be accurate, and Washington's no longer there to compare, so it becomes recognized as accurate. So by this time, even before the Lansdowne print gets there, printmakers are already active in sort of taking Stuart's head and putting it on other bodies. So in the center, you see Washington's head put on a seated portrait by another artist named Edward Savage, and put into military uniform. You can see the head doesn't quite sit right, I think, on that body. And the two images on either side are both more complex allegorical compositions, where you have Stuart's head being put on military bodies by John Trumbull. The one on the right is just this great image of Washington resigning his commission at the end of the Revolutionary War with Mount Vernon in the background. So it's sort of all mixed up historically, but it has this great symbolism. So Stuart's portrait, these prints, all post-date Washington's retirement. So they're entering a market of imagery that is created during the presidency that is dominated by two lesser-known American artists named Joseph Wright and Edward Savage. And both of these artists, I think, are notable for their experiments, again, on that question of how do you represent a Republican leader. Now, Joseph Wright was an American. He was actually the son of a celebrated wax sculptor, not his father, but his mother, a woman named Patience Wright, who was really sort of the forerunner of Madame Tussaud. In 1783, Wright painted Washington from life at the end of the Revolution. You see that at the left. He also created two relief busts where he experimented with portraying Washington as a classical hero, which you see in the center. But despite the widespread celebration of Washington as the American Cincinnatus, named after the Roman general who gave up power after defeating Rome's enemies in order to return to civilian life. This pioneering portrait of Washington a la antique didn't really catch on. And so after Washington was elected president in 1790, Wright created this small, and this little etching of Washington, the profile view of Washington in a uniform, was only about 3 inches high. So it was very collectible. You could send it through the mail. And he claimed that it was a candid likeness taken surreptitiously while observing Washington, I think, at church one day. But it likely drew on a life mask that he had created in 1783. But it's this very, and you can see it in the reliefs too, it's this very sharp-featured profile, which contrasts with the much sort of softer contours that you see in earlier portraits by Charles Willson Peale, as well as the Stuarts. Now, Wright died in 1793, but his profile portrait lived on. in part because as a profile, it was easier to copy than the more three-dimensional views. And it was especially popular for medals. You see a couple of the medals based on it at the bottom, as well as medallion portraits that were incorporated as little oval vignettes and printed on broadsides, magazine illustrations, sheet music, ceramics, needlework. So it's a very popular option in 1800. Edward Savage was a self-taught but ambitious New Englander, and he was really a major precursor to Stuart in trying to create a presidential portrait. So his story of Washington starts in 1789 when he solicits a portrait sitting from Washington to paint a portrait of Washington in military uniform for Harvard University. Then he goes to London, and in 1772 he issued the next portrait at the top, a stipple engraving of Washington, again in uniform, and Josiah Quincy, president of Harvard, pronounces this the best likeness he had ever seen of George Washington. And I would note that you can take any portrait of George Washington from life, and I can find you someone who said it was the most accurate likeness, despite their differences. So there's a lot of promotion going on here of your favorite artist. In any case, it was a significant updating of Washington portraiture, which really dated back prior to the Constitutional Convention. And as one art historian has written, it must have seemed far more current than many of the prints in circulation. It was much copied by both American and European printmakers and book publishers. But then in you see one of the copies below there on in the middle. But then in 1793, Savage tried something new, and he issued the first significant print to show Washington in civilian garb. And again, this harks very much back to that seated portraits of European gentlemen that Stuart did that we saw earlier. Same format, but he's adding the trappings of state portraiture, that portico-like space, the drapery, the column, and specific accoutrements of the presidency. Instead of the military uniform, he's put Washington in the black velvet suit, and he's holding a plan of the new capital city, the city of Washington. So this likeness represented a new type of Washington engraving, as art historian Wendy Wick writes in her detailed study of Washington prints, quote, "Here was a statesman rather than a soldier, a man with age, wisdom, and dignity in his face, truly a presidential image." All of this is to say that when Washington dies in September 1799, there's lots of choices for printers and publishers rushing to meet the demand. Pirating was rife among the memorial prints, the eulogies, broadsides, sheet musics, and other genres that were rushed into production after Washington's death. And here you see some of the different interpretations. On the left, two of the Wright portrait, the one on the bottom being used in a publication of eulogies. In the second from the left, you see the Savage, and then in the final one, the Gilbert Stuart. So they're all really popular and being used at this time. As the 19th century progressed, these likenesses moved from paintings and prints into a wide array of decorative and useful goods, what we might today almost call licensed products. These range from mass-produced commercial projects carried to America by a burgeoning global trade. You have porcelain and earthenware jugs from China and England. And you have on the bottom one-off memorial works created largely by young women in female academies who are making memorials of various kinds to George Washington and often incorporating miniature portraits by Wright, Savage, and Stuart. So, moving forward in time, there have been multiple efforts then to re-envision George Washington. Artists or patrons who are saying, we don't really think that the Stuart is the best representation of George Washington. And so these efforts to establish authoritative best likenesses of George Washington attempts to establish an official version that would effectively crystallize his visage for posterity. So in these efforts, which I'll talk about a little bit, we see the three basic traditions that emerge for representing Washington. You have the historic military commander, which remains the favored type throughout Washington's life. You have the contemporary civilian statesman, that gentleman in the black velvet suit, and you have the timeless classical hero, either draped or undraped, invoking the iconography of ancient Rome to portray Washington as a timeless hero, a man for the ages, uniting the American Republic to its classical precursors. So I want to look at just three of those episodes. And the first is what I would call Thomas Jefferson's New Washington. Yes, this is Washington. In 1814, the North Carolina legislature proposed to commission a monumental statue of Washington for the State House. Naturally, they sought advice from Thomas Jefferson, who was perhaps the most avid and influential advocate of the classical tradition in America. Jefferson enthusiastically recommended the Italian sculptor Antonio Canova. Quote, "Who should make it? There can be but one answer. Old Canova of Rome. For 30 years, he has been considered by all Europe as without a rival." Now, the problem, of course, Washington had been dead for 15 years, and Canova had never seen him. So, lacking a living model, Jefferson proposed, or urged really, that Canova take as his model a bust that had been sculpted from life in 1792 by another Italian, Giuseppe Ceracchi. And you see Ceracchi's original model on the right. And this Jefferson praised, rather curiously, I think, since he had known Washington, as, quote, "universally considered as the best effigy of Washington ever executed." Quite different than how we usually think of Washington. So Canova's result, which you see in the center on the left, is a strikingly original George Washington. Here we see a young man, broad-shouldered, muscular, sharp-featured, his hair cut short, in the fashion that Jefferson himself had adopted, as you see on the right, and was strongly associated with Republican political leanings. Now, Canova's Washington, I think, is physically at odds with prevailing depictions of Washington, which tend to show Washington with sloping shoulders, a thick torso and thighs, long legs, a rounded, somewhat placid face, and long hair tied back in a queue, which was an older style politically associated with the Federalists. But the Canova statue, as we've said, was produced at a time when many of those who had actually known Washington had passed from the scene. And so I think it's a work that is in dialogue not so much with the actual living person, but with all the competing representations of that person, both verbal and visual. So if I might wax a bit poetic here, I think it's less George Washington than the idea of George Washington, a Platonic ideal from which everything transient has been stripped away, leaving only the essence. So when I go to look at the statue, I think, that's not the Washington I know. But then the more I look at it, the more I feel like it is this essence that I do know. It's a military leader, identified by his attire and the sword at his feet, but is also a statesman, identified by the tablet he holds, which the inscription tells us in Italian that it's Washington's farewell address, issued in September 1796, in which he announced his retirement and articulated his hopes for the country. So historically, the George Washington of the farewell address was no longer the supremely fit young soldier, but rather a supremely wise elder statesman. In combining the warrior and the statesman, then, Canova evokes a mythic lawgiver, the founder giving men laws by giving up power. Again, harking back to that idea of the American Cincinnatus. Sadly, the North Carolina State House burned in 1831, completely destroying Canova's original marble statue. So what you see here is the plaster model, which survived in his studio in Italy and was basically not known to people in America. So here you lose the opportunity of the proliferation and influence of this portrayal of Washington. In the meantime, Rembrandt Peale, son of George Washington's most frequent portraitist, Charles Willson Peale, Rembrandt had embarked in 1823 on his own mission to craft a definitive likeness of Washington. Ironically, this was the very year that an obscure young artist named John Neal, anyone ever heard of him? No. Asserted that the only idea we have of George Washington is associated with Stuart's Washington, opining that though a better likeness of him were shown to us, we should reject it. And this is quoted over and over again today as evidence that Stuart's image was immediately the image of Washington. But Neal himself, I think, was a pretty obscure writer. Nothing daunted, Peale created a composite Washington, both idealized and romanticized, drawing upon what he thought were the best features of each life portrait, none of which he thought had done justice to the nobility, the inner character of their subject. Peale's Portraiture, or porthole portrait as it was called, incorporated elements of both Stuart's likeness and the 1785 likeness bust that had been created by the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon, which Stuart himself thought the best likeness of Washington. Now, Peale's new image proved a resounding success, again helped along by timing. Stuart was by then 69, nearing the end of his career and production, and would die in 1828. Also helped along by Peale's stupendous talents as a promoter. By 1830, he had displayed the original of his portrait to public audiences in Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Rome, Naples, Florence, Paris, and London. By 1827, he had created a lithographic version, and in 1832, he succeeded in selling the original of what he called his national standard likeness to Congress. Peale devoted virtually the rest of his life to Washington, eventually painting more than 6 of these portraits, with the later military option vastly outnumbering the civilian version. The next incident I would point to is that of Emanuel Leutze, a German-born American painting who was working in Dusseldorf, Germany, and he inserted a full-length portrait of Washington in profile in his monumental history painting. This is a sharp-featured profile, reminiscent, I think, of both Wright and Canova, but probably based on the life mask created by Houdon in 1785, a copy of which Leutze owned. So, fast forward to 1932. The George Washington Bicentennial was a 9-month-long extravaganza devoted to celebrating the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. Congressionally mandated to ensure, quote, that future generations of Americans may live according to the example and precepts of Washington's exalted life and character, and thus perpetuate the American Republic. Drum roll, please. New York Congressman Saul Bloom, who was the director of the U.S. George Washington Bicentennial Commission, he had a branding dilemma. Of the many likenesses of George Washington, which should be the official face of the Bicentennial? Bloom convened a committee of experts to identify the most authentic and accurate likeness. And their choices, their shortlist is not surprising. The 1772 early portrait of George Washington, painted before the Revolution, John Trumbull's vision of the military general, and 2 of Gilbert Stuart's works. But the commission couldn't agree from this shortlist. So failing that, the committee turned to sculpture, nominating the undraped classical bust by Houdon, which the artist had presented to George Washington and which remains preserved at Mount Vernon today. Created from life in 1785, I think this is a penetrating psychological study in which the only distracting costume element is an inconspicuous ribbon binding the general's hair. The committee cited 3 key factors in their selection: authenticity, regarded as most authentic due to its close relationship to the life mask that Houdon made at the same time, its aesthetic quality, and perhaps surprisingly, its potential to humanize George Washington. Quote, "It is hard," the committee noted, "to feel on familiar terms with a demigod, or to think of the Washington in the Stuart painting as a human being beset with the same impulses and difficulties which constitute our personal problems today." And so an official photograph of Houdon's Washington was slated to appear on all commissioned publications, with a poster sent, to every schoolroom in the nation. The public, however, did not agree. As the Washington Post reported, the American people, quote, "plainly enough indicated that's not our George Washington," referring to the Houdon. And in the face of this displeasure, the commission retreated, issuing a press release conceding that, quote, "it can unqualifiedly be said that the Athenaeum portrait is and always has been the best known and most popular painting of George Washington." The experts, it seemed, had made a mistake, privileging accuracy of likeness over recognizability of image. And so, Stuart's Athenaeum portrait became the bicentennial mascot, active symbol of the celebration, the people's choice, accorded authenticity by popular vote. Painstakingly reproduced in a chromolithograph, which you see here, the Athenaeum portrait went out across the nation. 1.3 million copies printed and distributed to every schoolroom and post office, as well as railroad stations, club rooms, churches, and other gathering places. The Houdon remained the commission's official brand, appearing on letterhead, medals, and importantly, the Washington Quarter, introduced in 1932 and persisting with minor alterations to the present. So on the coinage of the realm, you have a profile portrait based on Houdon's heroic nude, a Washington for the ages, linking the present to the early republic and its classical ideals. On the dollar bill, however, Stuart's Athenaeum portrait has appeared continuously, again with minor alterations, since 1869. So, enduring coins, ephemeral paper money, endlessly repeating images that continually reinforce George Washington's role as quite literally the face of the nation and the head of state. So this brings us back to the broader view of Washington portraiture that I began with, and an argument about why all this matters. Because Washington's contemporaries clamored for likenesses and artists vied to create them, we have an abundance of lifetime portraits offering competing visions of the first president. The sheer number of these images and the lack of agreement between them as to what George Washington looked like, I think that's what's really important, because these represent different ways that contemporaries saw George Washington. As America's first president, Washington is justly credited with establishing many precedents, but one that he did not set was that of creating a paradigm for how we would see him, how we would remember him, how the head of state should be represented visually. As a result, artists and audiences up to the present have been free to choose among alternatives the likeness that best expressed their notion of the head of state. And this seems to me a distinctly participatory, even democratic process for creating a national iconography. The templates that we have for envisioning George Washington as the embodiment of America's founding ideals are not the result of a top-down, authoritative dictate, but rather of this complex interplay of artistic talents, entrepreneurship, personal connections, and consumer preferences, which together has made our image of Washington truly the people's choice. And I think this proliferation of imagery has more than artistic significance, because Washington's image has played and continues to play a pivotal role in America's image of itself, its history, and its future. Precisely because no standard likeness emerged during his lifetime, there has been room for both contemporaries and subsequent generations to choose between these competing images, competing visions of what a Republican chief executive should or can be. And I think furthermore, that absence of an officially sanctioned portrait of Washington has kept his image from becoming static, has kept it dynamic and relevant, subject to continual variation as well as seemingly endless repetition. You know, we still see Washington's face appearing in editorials. We have a mascot for the Washington Nationals. We see, you know, watch for Washington. You see him all over. 2 centuries of what in modern jargon we call crowdsourcing, I think, has made his face, the face of the nation, far more effectively than any official state portrait of his crowned precursors. And the final point I want to make is more broadly theoretical, if you will, aimed at our understanding of images themselves, and an appeal really for visual literacy. Images are constructed. They are less windows on the world than interpretations of it. And as digital images become ever more prevalent, I think it behooves us, indeed it is critical, that we not take them for granted or as mere illustrations, but that we actively engage in decoding them, to analyzing them carefully, to understanding them as deliberate communications with specific histories, points of view, messages, embedded arguments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We got time for a few questions, so if anyone has a question, please raise your hand if you have a question. In this group that ought to have questions. There's one right here. Here we go.
Let me get a mic too. I was just wondering, was there an official proclamation of the image that's now on the dollar bill by the Congress or something? How was that actually designated or established?
So that's a great question about how the image on the dollar bill was established, and I have to confess that's a chapter I haven't gotten to yet, so I'm going to be, what I can tell you is that Washington was adamantly opposed to having his face on either the coinage or the currency of the new republic. And so there were many people who assumed that that would be the case, but he thought that was too much of a monarchical tradition. And so he actively rejected that, wanted things like the Great Seal or allegorical figures to be on that early money of the United States. So it is really not until after the Civil War, and I think it's part of the process of bringing the country back together, creating this sense of unity. But studying numismatic history is really tough because it's really written for collectors and it's hard to step back and get the big picture. So invite me back in a couple of years and maybe I can answer that.
You've got an invitation to come back. Yes, sir, right here. Here comes the microphone right at you.
Do you have any details on the painting on the extreme first row on the left of Washington by Peel, dated 1772? That's I think that's his French and Indian War uniform, and I just wondered if...
Yes, sure. I can tell you a little bit more about that. The portrait of which you see a detail on the far left is the only portrait of Washington that we have that is painted before the Revolutionary War. It's painted at Mount Vernon in 1772 by Charles Willson Peale, specifically at the request of Martha Washington, because she had a pair of portraits of herself and her first husband, and she wanted to have her second husband to hang in the parlor with her own portrait. It is often titled George Washington as a Virginia colonel. In fact, my military history colleagues tell me that it's not exactly his French and Indian War uniform, but he has, in fact, updated it slightly to make it not look old-fashioned in 1772. But that one did get completed, and it did hang in the parlor at Mount Vernon, and it is currently in the collection of Washington and Lee University. And I am very pleased to say that you will shortly be seeing press releases that announcing a loan exchange between Mount Vernon and Washington and Lee University, where we will be loaning them our Gilbert Stuart Athenaeum portrait, and this 1772 portrait of George Washington will be coming home to Mount Vernon on loan, and we're very excited about that and hope you'll come and see it there.
Yes, we have time for one more question here.
Would you think that the portrait that Martha Washington was disappointed that didn't get finished, the one by Stuart with George Washington's head above the clouds, do you think that that would have, since she would have known him the best, would that have been, or do we know in any writings of hers that?
Do we know which she thought was the best portrait?
Yeah.
That one, the unfinished one in the sort of in the clouds, that's not the one she was disappointed with. She was reportedly disappointed with the Vaughan portrait, which looks the other way. This one she never got. And there are some very poignant letters written after George Washington's death by his secretary to Stuart saying, please finish the portrait and deliver it to Mrs. Washington. She really wants it. So I think she did like that portrait.
And before everyone leaves, let me introduce and welcome Teri Garner, the director of the Clinton Presidential Library, and Kurt Sen, the deputy director of the Clinton Presidential Library. They have a fabulous collection themselves. Let's give Susan a wonderful round of applause.